Welcome, everybody. On this Friday evening, you came out in great numbers to talk about climate change. Usually not a bit of a depressing topic, but maybe not tonight. Let's see. My name is Jaap Tielbeke. I'm a climate journalist for the Groene Amsterdammer. And to keep up to date with everything that's happening in the field, I subscribe to a lot of newsletters from colleagues all across the world. And when you read them, they usually don't paint a pretty picture. You know, there's articles about the sixth mass extinction, about rising CO2 levels, forest fires, droughts, floods. And usually the idea is then it's even worse than you thought, and you just want to curl up into a fetal position and stay in bed all the time. But there's one exception, and that's a newsletter of Hannah Ritchie. It's called Sustainability by Numbers. And I think it's fair to say that Hannah is quite fond of numbers. She she studied environmental science. She's now a data scientist at the Oxford University, and she's an editor at the website Our World in Data, which collects data and a lot of statistics and graphs. And the questions she answers in her newsletters are sometimes quite straightforward. Simple questions like, are electric cars really better for the environment than petrol cars? Answer is yes. Or is plant-based milk more environmental friendly than cow milk? Again, yes. And the thing that is interesting is that she also points to positive developments, things that are already actually heading in the right direction. And that's kind of refreshing, a refreshing perspective. And that's also what she does in her latest book, which we're presenting today in the Dutch translation, Niet het einde van de wereld, not the end of the world. I have to say also that this conversation this evening is being recorded, so choose your words carefully when you want to ask a question later on. And in this book, she also pushes back on what she calls doomerism, that feeling that is not unfamiliar to me, that you can have that feeling that all is lost and there's nothing we can do about it anymore. She argues that we also need to look at the positive trends, at the positive stories, and to pay attention to the possible solutions, because we are actually are capable of solving this problem. She's not saying that we definitely will, but she's saying that the opportunities are there. So that's what we're going to discuss tonight. We'll have a Q&A, Hannah, me at first, and then I'll move the questions open for the audience, because I can assume that we'll get a lively debate going. But first, please give it up, a warm applause for Hannah Ritchie. How are you doing, Hannah? You had a full day of interviews already. We chatted briefly this morning, yeah. And then after that you had like 5 more interviews.
Yeah, this is my 6th interview of the day, so I'm feeling fresh.
But the first one with a live audience, so I think this is going to top all the other ones.
Thank you all for coming. I hope we have a good conversation.
So you read in your book that when you were writing this, you had a picture of your younger self near your computer. And you mentioned that this is the book that you needed 10 years ago. Could you explain that? What kind of book did you need 10 years ago, and what did you want to say to your younger self?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm part of a generation that has kind of always grown up with climate change. Like, I remember even as a kid being already very anxious about what the future looked like. And then I went to study environmental sciences at university, and, you know, as you expect, just everything's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And kind of environmentalism was my passion, tackling climate change was my passion, but I think I got to the stage where things looked so bleak that I felt completely helpless to do anything about it. I didn't really feel like there'd be a future there for me. And I think that, in some sense, is a very kind of dangerous position to be in, at a stage when we really need to be taking action, to feel completely helpless and like there's nothing we can do. Like when I was writing the book, I felt like I was trying to write the book for my younger self, because I also know there's a lot of people today that feel exactly the same. Like, you can see it in survey data, like I see it in the emails that land in my inbox, that people feel like there really is no future there for them and kind of all hope is lost. So I wanted to write a book that's saying, yes, these problems are big, but like, don't lose hope completely. Like, there is stuff that we can do about this.
Right. And could you have written a book like this 10 years ago? Because I have the feeling that the world right now, when it comes to environmental issues, looks fundamentally different than 10 years ago.
No, I think I wouldn't have been able, like, if I wrote a book today, it would have been called "It's the End of the World." I think the world has moved on a lot in the last 10 years. I think climate change is actually just much more on the radar. I think people have started taking climate scientists seriously. I think environmental activism has done a lot to contribute to that. So I think it's maybe not as high on the agenda as we would want to be, but it is on the agenda. And I think one of the kind of fundamental changes for me that makes me more optimistic than I was 10 years ago is when I was looking 10 years ago, it seemed completely helpless that we would be able to tackle this, right? Like, the fundamental issue with climate change is moving away from fossil fuels. And if you looked at what all of the alternatives to fossil fuels were, they were way more expensive than fossil fuels. Like, solar and wind were really expensive, batteries, electric vehicles. So it was even be a struggle to convince rich countries to invest in these technologies when they were really expensive, even though they should have. But it was impossible for middle and low income countries to implement these technologies because they have billions of people in energy poverty. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is a complete kind of flipping upside down, where many of these low carbon technologies are now competitive or cheaper than fossil fuels. So I think that for me has been like a big, massive change over the last decade. And I think we are in a different position than we were 10 years ago.
Yeah, so that's one of the positive developments you're pointing to. Are there any other of those big kind of global trends perhaps that give cause for optimism?
Yeah, I mean, there are a range of countries that are now reducing emissions. Like, in most rich countries, emissions are falling. Now, some of that has been from offshoring to other countries, so they are producing stuff that we're then importing, but that's not all of the decline. And even when you adjust for that, emissions are falling. They're not falling fast enough. And I think we are now starting to see, like, further down the income distribution, that middle income countries are now starting to deploy these solutions pretty quickly. I think it's only until very, very recently that we've actually been able to see that you can roll this stuff out quickly. Like, I think China's a very good example to point to, where last year China installed enough solar and wind to power the UK or France. And then 1 year's installations has gone from, a tiny share of electric vehicle sales. This year, probably 40% of new cars will be electric. So I think there are a range of stories there where you can see that it's possible that this stuff can actually move quickly. And I think as the costs continue to fall, I think that just actually feeds into this, where you could see much faster rise.
And do you think that we in general, perhaps climate journalists in particular, have a tendency to overlook those positive trends and to focus on what is going wrong and the negative trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need a balance. Like, you need the stories of disaster, the stories of impact, to keep people engaged and make it very clear, like, what's at stake. But I think it is important to also cover, what's actually happening on the solution side. I think if you just tell people, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, you kind of leave them with no understanding of how can we tackle this, is it anything happening? I think the issue there is that often the kind of impacts are like single events, right? And that's what the news does. It tells us about an event that's happened in the world. Many of these transformations are not, single events. They're like progressions day after day, month after month, year after year. So there's not like a clinch, like this is the event on solar that makes the headlines, but these trends are happening. We're just not seeing them.
But I guess the same is true for climate change and environmental degradation, right? So let me ask you, the question is, could I pick a different set of metrics, a different set of statistics, mostly from environmental scientists, and write a book that paints an entirely different picture and that is equally true?
Yeah, I think it's about your outlook on how things could change in the future. I mean, I think the book probably that we would write about where we are today is quite similar. I think it's about what's your level of optimism that the future can be different from how it is today. And I think probably that's where I have a bit more optimism, is that I can see that we could fundamentally change this. Now, I'm not going to say we are, like I can't control what we do, but I think the opportunity's there. And what I'm trying to do is highlight this is the opportunity we have. Come on, guys, let's go and get it.
Right. So let's talk a bit about your subtitle, which I think was very interesting. Because you mentioned that we are actually the first generation that can create a sustainable future. Can you explain what you mean by that subtitle?
Yeah, so I think when we think about sustainability, like as an environmentalist, I think about protecting the environment for future generations and other species. And I think that's, a big part of this equation. But I think if you frame it in more of a way that's more aligned with what we'd call sustainable development, there's a second half to that equation, which is providing a good life for everyone today. So you want to provide a good life for everyone in the world today, but you also want to do it in a way that you don't degrade the environment, which robs future generations of opportunities and other species. And I think in the past, it's been very, very difficult to achieve both of those things at the same time. And I give some examples of kind of human progress metrics that in the past were very poor. So like child mortality, for example, it was a coin cost whether your child survived or not.
Right, yeah, and you show graphs in your book of that, how that changed over the past couple of centuries, that actually we are making a lot of progress in it when it comes to humanitarian metrics, whether it's child mortality, it's going down, poverty and hunger are going down, life expectancy is going up, but that comes at an environmental cost, right? And that's the other side of this idea of sustainability, like providing a good life for future generations.
Yeah, so in the past, our ancestors probably had a pretty low environmental footprint, so they achieved that half, but often human conditions were poor, so they didn't achieve that half. What we've seen over the last few centuries is that tip the other way, right? So we've made amazing progress on many of the human metrics. I mean, we're not where we want to be, but things have generally got better across the world, but it's came at the cost of the environment, right? We've burned fossil fuels for energy that's powered a lot of that. We've expanded farmland and cut down forests and breached into wild habitats. And the kind of hypothesis I put forward in the book is that I think we are at this kind of unique point where I can see a future where you can provide a good life for 8, 9, 10 billion people and also do that while reducing your environmental impact.
Yeah. So in the book, like there's two, let's say, major components to emissions, carbon emissions. It's the energy system and food production, right?
Yeah.
And so the energy production side, I can totally see where your optimism is coming from. Like the technological developments are going really quickly, much faster than a lot of experts even predicted. We can see it's being rolled out, especially in high-income countries right now. So I get the optimism there. I have the feeling that there's also slightly less optimism when it comes to the food production part. You point out that when we need to go to a sustainable food system, we need to have a much more plant-based diet, eat less meat and dairy, increase crop yields and stuff like that. But I don't really see... I have the feeling that there's a longer way to go there, and actually the transition there is much harder. Would you agree?
I totally agree. Yeah, I think on energy, I'm much more optimistic because I can see there that things are moving. I'm much less optimistic on food. I think what I tried to do with the focus on food is that I think people get generally with energy like what the impact is, right? People get now that burning fossil fuels emits CO2 and leads to climate change. And I think people get that now. What I wanted to do in the food is like more fundamentally like lay out what does the food system look like, what are the impacts, because I think people are actually unaware of what that looks like and what food production at a global level looks like and how that's distributed. So what I kind of wanted to achieve with that is one, try and provide people with a better understanding of the food system and its environmental impact, and then in some sense offer this is what the world could look like, but I'm more pessimistic that we get there quickly. I think one, because food is such a individual choice, right? With like energy, okay, some people have quite strong opinions about where energy comes from, but for most people they just want cheap, reliable energy.
Right.
But food, it's like individual choices 3 or 4 times a day.
Yeah, and with energy, those cheap, reliable sources are now coming increasingly from clean sources, from renewable energy. When it comes to food choices, you can say they're individual choices, but you can also, government policy can shape individual choices either by subsidizing or taxing the unsustainable options. But then you would have to have like more of a sacrifice. If you have solar panels on your roof, that's good for you because you get cheap energy.
Right.
People would want to invest in that. But if you'd have to skip your meatballs or not being allowed to eat your steak, people at least feel it as a sacrifice, and it's something that the government policy shouldn't touch. That's up to them. So how do you view this? That the idea is that they actually have to give up something for the environment?
No, I think that's a fundamental issue. I mean, I always stay away from framing it as a sacrifice because I'm a vegan, so I quite like the meat substitutes and they work for me. But no, I think especially when it comes to like what you eat, like for many people, like do not tell me what to eat. Like I even had to be very careful in the book of like not being prescriptive of like stop eating meat.
I thought that was interesting because you're very clear in your argument that the only way we're gonna tackle this part of the climate crisis, the food production, is eating less meat. But then you're very reluctant to say, you're saying, oh, well, I just give you the information of how bad it is to eat meat, but what you do with that information is up to you. But are we really gonna get there? That is, I think, I felt like that is a bit of a cop-out, if I may say so.
No, I think we need to create incentives for people. I mean, if you tell people what to eat, you will create a backlash and it will be detrimental to environmental action. So you need to create some environment where people are incentivized to make that choice on their own. And I can see it from my own life. Like I went vegetarian and then I went vegan, and even the people around me, I'm very deliberate not to judge what they're eating, but I can see my choices are making an impact, right? I think they take part in a kind of vegan meal. They like the meal. They can see what I'm doing. They might go
without saying anything. By your choice, you're passing a moral judgment. That's the way it experiences.
I don't think they see it as a moral judgment. I think they just see, oh, maybe I could try that. And then, like, none of them have gone fully vegan, but they've significantly reduced meat consumption. Yeah.
Right. So what is also interesting in your book is that you take away of a lot of misconceptions. You point out that we tend to focus on the wrong things or even make choices that are intuitively feel right and feel environmental friendly, but are actually counterproductive. So I was wondering if you could just, for the audience here, point out a few of these things that we shouldn't really worry that much about, or even choices that are not as environmental friendly as we feel they are.
Right. So if you ask people like, what's the best thing to do for the environment? They often mention stuff like recycling or not using plastic bags, or they focus on the lights in their home. And these things are all fine to do, but they make a pretty small impact on your like overall carbon footprint. So if those are the only things that you're focusing on, you're missing most of your emissions. And I think that's the risk there. That's a kind of called moral licensing, where you feel like you've done your bit, but you've only done a little bit and you've missed the big bit. So I think it's about highlighting to people these are the big things that you can do to move the needle. And then I think there are kind of common misconceptions of stuff that intuitively feel like obviously they would be better for the environment, but the data doesn't necessarily back that up. Like I think a big one is if you ask people what's the best way to reduce the carbon footprint of your diet, they'll say eat locally. Now the rationale there makes sense, right? We know that transporting stuff emits CO2, therefore if it's traveled really far to reach me, obviously that's really, really bad. I think the issue there is that when you break down food system emissions globally, transport's only around 5%. So it's actually quite a small part of the puzzle. Most emissions come from land use change or emissions on the farm. And so what you're producing and how you're producing it matters much, much more than how far it's travelled to reach you. Now, that doesn't mean you can't eat local. There are other reasons why you would want to eat locally. But if you're doing it solely for carbon footprint and not focusing on what you eat, then you're probably making a kind of detrimental decision.
Right. So I want to talk a bit about doomers, because you take issue with that position. You are using it as a, something you resist, doomerism. Can you tell me who or what do you consider a doomer? Who is this book? Who are you writing against, so to speak?
I think the way I frame doomer is it's not someone that thinks climate change will be bad, or because that's my position. Someone that has basically taken the position that it's too late and there's nothing we can do about it. Or they make a statement which they might not outright say it's too late and there's nothing we can do about it, but underlying it, there's nothing we can do about it. Like if you say 6 billion people are going to die from this, you're basically saying it's too late and there's nothing we can do about it. If you say that, we've only got 5 years, then you're saying it's too late and there's nothing we can do about it. And I think there's a couple of reasons why I think that's messaging is really detrimental. I mean, one, like if we're saying it's too late, then that's not going to lead to action. That's going to lead to paralysis and inaction. Mm-hmm. I think for many people it has a significant impact on their mental health, and I say that as someone from experience and from the emails that land on my inbox, like really pretty dark emails. And often these people will point me to like a YouTube video or a blog where the statements in there are not scientifically true. They're completely wrong. But that's the type of messaging that's coming through to them, and they kind of feel like they have no future left. So that's what I'm trying to push back on. And then I think there's the other angle to this where these really extreme statements that are based around this kind of doomerism, I actually think have the opposite effect on the other side, where people that might engage, when they see the really extreme messages, actually they get pushed back and away from it because they find it hard to engage with. And then I think the final one is that like many of these kind of framings are like a gift to people on the really skeptical side, where when your prediction that the world will end in 5 years doesn't come true, like then they turn around and say, look how ridiculous the scientists are, they're trying to dupe us. Yeah.
So I was curious because in your introduction, or at least in the beginning of your book, you also mentioned 2 activist groups, the German activist group Letzte Generation and Extinction Rebellion, as, I don't know if you see them as truly proponents of doomerism, but you do have a big problem with their strategy and their messaging, I feel like. But then, I mean, to me, those are groups who are operating from an assumption that things are really bad and things are moving in the wrong direction quickly, but and maybe you can take issue with some of the claims they're making, but their fundamental message is still that we need to change things. They're taking to the streets and protesting because they want to create societal change. How do you view that?
No, I'm not against these activist groups.
But you do mention them critically in the book, right? In the beginning.
Yeah, so there's some spokespeople from these groups that have made...
You mentioned these 2 groups in particular, not any particular spokesperson, but really... Maybe I interpreted it wrong, but in the beginning you seem to say that these arguments or these movements and their messaging is harmful.
No, I don't think that overall movements are harmful. Like I'm supportive of these groups. Like I think they have done a really good job at drawing attention to the issue. I think there are particular messages that have come out from, and it's not everyone in the group. Obviously, it's not everyone in the group, but they kind of lead spokespeople that are wrong. And I think if that's the leading message, that for many people that's a hard message to get behind. When it comes to last generation, I mean, I think it ties in with the first generation. I think I just have a different, it's like the upside down.
Yeah, because you seem to interpret it, at least that's what I got reading from your book, as the last generation, like we're the last generation afterwards, all is going to shit and we're doomed. But I interpret it as we're the last generation that can actually perhaps make this change and make this difference. And that, like you said, it can tie into, it can both be true. It can both be the first and the last generation that are perhaps capable of making this change.
Sure, no, I agree. But I guess it's just like a different framing. Do you frame it in a damage limitation way, or do you frame it in an opportunity way? And I'm trying to reframe it as an opportunity way of it's not just how can we limit the damage of climate change as much as possible, which kind of leads to this notion that life will inevitably be worse. It's just how much worse will it get, to a framing of, no, actually the future can be better and we have an opportunity here.
Right. So I guess what I'm wondering, and I think what I disagree with in the assumption of the book, is that doomerism or exaggerated alarmism is more harmful to the climate movement than what I think is the main barrier. Like the silent majority of people who would acknowledge it's a problem, but don't really feel the urgency or are not really have the idea of what is at stake here. Like my feeling is that, you know, these groups have been effective in somewhat of a wake-up call, but there's still a silent majority who think that, you know, it won't be that bad. Climate change is a problem. Perhaps we can solve it, but, you know. So I was wondering how you feel about that, because those are probably not the people emailing you, but that I think it's still a large group in society.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, the framing of the book is I was writing it for my younger self, and that I was in that doomerism camp. So part of the role of the book is in some sense reaching out to people that are currently or feel like they're in that kind of doomerist camp. I don't think that necessarily doomerism is a bigger deal or worse than a kind of, I mean, it's definitely not worse than climate denial, but there's tons of books out there on that. I don't need to rehash that. And then I think there is a big middle. I think many people in the middle, if you look at survey data, are really worried about climate. Like, it is reasonably high on the priority list. It's never top of the priority list. And I think the question is, how do you then convince those people to step up and take more action? The question is just repeating how really bad it's going to be. Is going to push them towards action? And I think I'm a little bit skeptical that that's the case. I think if they were going to be really engaged, they would already be really engaged. Yeah. So you need to find another framing to get them engaged.
So, but why do you think that is? Because there is also research that suggests that actually maybe not fear alone, but fear and anger can also be quite a powerful motivational emotion, especially for climate activism. So do you think that, you know, that it has a function as well?
For sure. I think the way the book's framed, it's not that I'm like happy all the time and think this is fine. Like, I'm scared. I'm
you do want to push back. You're saying that we need more optimism to get people engaged.
Sure, you need a balance, right? So you need the sense of fear, concern to want to take action. And then you need to combine that with a sense that things can change. I think the risk is that you only have the fear and the concern, and you have no notion that anything could change in the future. So you've got no hope. So you're just left with a problem with no sense that there could ever be any solution.
Yeah. But you would agree also that, I think you mentioned it in the beginning also, is that part of the progress we've seen over the past 10 years or so is thanks to the climate movement and activist groups who've put this topic high on the agenda.
For sure. I think the question then is, once it's on the agenda, how do you then move that forward? And it's not obvious that the message that would get you from A to B is necessarily the message that gets you to B to C.
So you think we're at a different stage now?
Right.
And we need
if a critical mass of people are already engaged, the question is then, how do you take that engagement into action? And it's not necessarily that you have exactly the same message. You can have elements of it. Like, as I say, you need to keep up, you know, the messaging of what's at stake. These are the potential impacts. This is where we're going. Yeah. I think you also need the message of how you transform engagement into action.
Right. So what I found interesting is that you have this optimistic message, and you think there's also a lot of progress is being made. It's undoubtedly true, but still you acknowledge that, you know, the 1.5 degrees, we're probably not going to meet that target. We're going to shoot at least over 1.5, probably over 2, and, you know. But then again, I would ask, is there reason for optimism, in the sense that I can see that, you know, the worst projections that were there 5-10 years ago now seem increasingly unlikely, and that's obviously good news. But we're still heading into like very uncharted territory. I mean, we're facing the collapse of the ecological foundation that the entire human civilization, modern civilization that we know of, is built on. So you have this notion of progress over the past few centuries, and you have them with statistics, but this is all within the context of a relatively stable climate, and that is very likely going to change in the next decades or even centuries. So can you still hold on to that same notion of progress?
Yeah, so we are currently on track for between 2.5 and 3 degrees, which is completely unacceptable and pretty catastrophic. But we are on a better trajectory than we were a decade ago. Like a decade ago, we were talking about 4 or 5 degrees. Now, that's not that we should, clap and cheer, but it is a sign of progress. And if we can go from that to 2.5 to 3 degrees, why can we not go from 2.5 degrees to almost 2 degrees? Now, I agree, I think 1.5 degrees is gone. On 2 degrees, very, very difficult, potentially achievable, but it would need really, really drastic action. But I am pretty optimistic we can get close to 2 degrees. Now, there will just be, I see ice sheets behind me. There will just be severe damages and irreversible impact. We need to confront that and be honest about that. I think I reject the notion necessarily that the future has to be worse at 2 degrees. I frame it as we're currently in a race of.
So you do think that in a 2 degrees world, let's say, we can continue this progress that we've been making over the past centuries? We can continue that line?
I think it'll be very, very difficult. It'll get increasingly difficult. The way I frame it or see it is that we are kind of in a race where climate impacts are escalating and we are trying to keep up to basically become resilient to those. And so far, to some extent, we've been keeping up, right? There have been really severe events, but climate deaths from disasters have gone down, not because climate change isn't happening or is not escalating that, but we've just managed to keep up with infrastructure and technology. Adaptation. The issue is that going from up to 1.3 degrees is not the same as going from 1.3 to 2 because it's non-linear impact.
Right.
So we basically need to run much, much faster. Then there's the open question, can we run faster? And I think there is a chance that we can. We can't run fast enough to 3 degrees, which is why we need to keep it as close to 2 degrees as we possibly can.
Yeah. So let's get back to renewable energies real quick because, like we mentioned earlier, you see cost plunging, all the conditions are in the right place for a massive rollout of these clean energy technologies. But at the same time, we see how persistent the fossil fuel economy is. So it's not only a matter of rolling out clean and sustainable alternatives, it's also a matter of dismantling the fossil fuel economy, which has very powerful vested interests. So you don't really go into that in your book, and I was wondering, what's your view on that?
So I think there's different stories for different fuels. I think coal will now just be in structural decline. I think the world will pretty rapidly move away from coal. I think partly due to the growth of renewables. I think there are other big reasons why countries are incentivized to move away from coal, air pollution being a big one. So I think the move away from coal will happen. I think gas and oil in particular will be very, very stubborn. I think it's very clear that the fossil fuel industry they're going to come along dragging their heels. They're not going to, they could play a big role in moving this. They're very large profits. They could invest in a clean transition. I think it would be profitable for them to invest in a clean transition, but I'm very skeptical that they will.
Because you saw the news coming out at the recent COP that oil countries are devising strategies to get developing countries hooked on fossil fuels because they want to make a buck while they still can.
So I think it would be a lot easier if fossil fuel companies would take a part in the transition, but I'm skeptical that they will. But I'm also optimistic about other technologies coming through. I think very soon electric cars actually will just make a dent in oil demand. If you look at projections from various agencies, International Energy Agency, Bloomberg, a variety, they are expecting that this decade oil use will also start to go into decline. I think the issue there is that if you look at projections, after the peak, it's a very, very slow decline. So the question is how we accelerate that.
Yeah, because at current pace, it's not going fast enough. So what I also noticed that your book is quite light on politics in a sense that you often end a chapter of we can solve this if we make the right decisions, if we go in the right directions. So I was wondering, the question then for me is, like, that's where the analysis started, like, why aren't we moving in the right direction, and what are the policies we might need to get this collective shift done? So I was wondering if it was a conscious decision not to address that in this book, and if so, why?
Yeah, it was a bit of a conscious decision not to make the book very political. What I want to achieve this book is, to some sense, reach a broad enough audience as I possibly can. And I think as soon as you make it very highly politicized, you alienate half of the population. I think we have this struggle at the moment where climate change is becoming probably has for a long time been a very polarized issue. And I actually think that polarization is not helping. And I think by stoking that polarization, there's the potential to make things worse, not better. Like, this is a decades-long transition, right? And we're going to have more than 100 governments that are going to swing from right to left every 4 or 5 years, and that's going to continue for hundreds of different countries across the world. We can't be in a position where we only ever make progress on climate when there's a left government in power, and we make no progress when there's a right government in power. So the question is, how do you try to bridge that gap and get some people on the right on board? And I actually think if you look at survey data, there's some countries that are really polarized, so like the US, for example. But on many countries, like right and left, people are generally pretty supportive of climate. And in particular, they're very supportive of clean energy on both left and right. So if you want to incentivize action, talk about clean energy. Like, that's often like a bridging gap for the left and the right. And as soon as I would love to talk all the time about climate, but in some sense, if you only talk about climate all the time, you alienate a big part of the audience.
Yeah, because you also said we can't wait until everybody is like a climate activist. We need people to make those choices for maybe different reasons than concern for climate.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of examples to point to there where it's not happening the way I would want it to happen, but it is happening. The US is a good example where, again, like, the climate is very partisan there. Like, the right don't like climate stuff, but they do really like clean energy. And if you look at the top 5 states in the US that have the most wind energy, they're all Republican. Now, if you look at the reasons why they're really in favor of wind energy, like, climate's really close to the bottom, but they're doing it for economic opportunities, or landowners getting income, or employment, or energy security is now a really big one. But that's fine. Like, they're deploying the energy and they'll reduce emissions and fossil fuels. So I think it's also about trying to tailor the message to a specific audience. So I was very deliberate about not trying to make this really highly politicized. I mean, there's loads of political climate books out there.
Right.
So,
but could I make an argument for polarization? And I come back to the climate movement again. And perhaps the most recent actions of Extinction Rebellion here in the Netherlands, where a lot of people, especially the ones who weren't concerned with climate change, they were quite annoyed of people, blocking the highways or causing disruptions. But there has this messaging about fossil fuel subsidies, which sounds kind of boring. But it is remarkable to see that these actions, by persistently taking this to the agenda, have reached also public debate, have reached debate in parliament, have led to political motions. And so people might not agree with those strategies, they might find them annoying, but eventually, public conversation will shift because of it. So how do you view that?
but how is that a left-right issue?
Well, I'm not saying it's a left-right issue. I'm saying it's groups like these are also being accused of polarizing it or politicizing the climate debate. And then you see that, this polarization effect is changing public debate.
Yeah, maybe that's fair. I think context matters. Like, this wouldn't work in the US. Like, if you were to stoke this in the US, I think maybe it works here. Because I don't know I'm less familiar with the politics, but in the UK, again, as I said, left and right are both pretty pro-climate policies. Like, we've actually had recently, it's been interesting because our Conservative Party leader tried to roll back. Well, we did roll back some climate policies, but it didn't help him. Like, his ratings went down, and it's very likely that that's going to backlash for him. And this year we'll have an election. And if you look at the polls, the the alternative party leaders now winning. So maybe context matters there, where if there is actually probably reasonable support on both right and left, then it has less of a dividing impact than if you're in the US, where it's very divisive.
I get what you mean. I guess my problem is that the idea of that we can depoliticize this issue is that we have like technocratic solutions that are just the way to go, and we need, to implement this technology because it's just rationally the best option. Whereas I feel like when it comes to climate change, we're faced with all these different kind of choices that have impact on society at large. It's about redistribution, it's about socioeconomic relations. So can you really take politics in that sense, not just party politics, but politics in that sense, out of the equation?
Not completely, and I mean, I would never argue that politics doesn't matter. Like, there's loads of examples in the book where policies that were like absolutely pivotal, not just on climate, but on air pollution or deforestation, or so. Like, yeah, of course, politics matters. I'm just trying to take a little bit of the fire out of it to reach a bit of a broader audience.
Okay, before I go to the audience, I want to move to another polarized debate, which is green growth versus degrowth debate. And in the book, you're quite critical of the degrowth movement, who have having a larger impact on public debate in recent years. I got the feeling. Explain to me your main issues and problems with the degrowth movement.
So, I think there are like different angles to it. One is global degrowth, which for me is like morally unacceptable. Like we still have billions.
What is the argument of global degrowth?
Well, the question is like degrowth for who, right?
Right.
Should the global economy degrow? If you have that, then you leave billions of people in poverty. So I think it's the contrast of, are you talking about global degrowth, or are you talking about degrowth in rich countries, for example?
Right, but I don't know anyone in the degrowth movement who would argue that rich countries couldn't grow anymore. Their argument is mostly that we should focus on, or developing countries can't grow anymore. The argument is mostly that because we need to give poorer countries, development countries, the space to develop within the planetary boundaries, we need actually in wealthy countries to look at reducing our energy consumption and resource consumption. So
there's different arguments for degrowth, like for degrowth. Yeah, there's one focus on.
I'm just saying I haven't heard the global. I don't know anybody arguing for the global degrowth.
I've heard it. Like there's the argument that yes, poor countries need to grow, but it's the question of, can you redistribute from rich countries to poor countries, and therefore do that in a way where global economy doesn't grow much or is stable. On that, like, no, we can't do that because we have billions of people in poverty. Like the question in rich countries on degrowth, I think probably the main contention is like how you would ever get the public to vote for this. Like for me, it seems like a political non-starter. I think it's really difficult to even get a main party leader to stand up and advocate for that. I think because they know that it would cost them the election. So I think for me, like, the main contention is how politically realistic it is that you do this. And time frame also matters, right? Like, we need to move on this really, really quickly. The carbon budget for 1.5 degrees would be up in the space of 5 or 6 years, probably. And I mean, in the UK, we are going to have an election this year. Neither candidate are going to advocate for that because they will lose. And then we're 4 years in the future. We're basically used up our carbon budget. Now, I agree on green growth. The argument against green growth is that decoupling of GDP from CO2 wouldn't be fast enough to keep temperatures to 1.5, which I agree with. Like, I think. So
decoupling, just to clarify, is that the economy, well, you have the difference between relative and absolute decoupling, but decoupling is that the economy keeps on growing and the environmental impact goes down or stagnates. Yeah.
I mean, we see evidence of that in rich countries, but it's not happening fast enough. And on that argument, I completely agree, or agreed on that.
So just an argument phrased or question phrased in a different way. Let's set aside the degrowth, green growth discussion a little bit, but can we tackle the climate crisis without addressing and talking about overconsumption, consumption and excessive consumption in rich countries?
I think there are ways to reduce that, I would just not frame it as degrowth. Like I think probably degrowth has a marketing problem where like it's just a really bad word that who wants to degrow. I think there are ways to tackle overconsumption. Like I think earlier we were talking about flying. Was it you?
Yeah. Frequent flying, or perhaps even private jets, which are this extreme symbol of the excessive carbon footprint of the super rich.
Right. So on flying, how do you do it in a way that you don't make things really tough for the family that goes on holiday once a year, because that would be really politically unfavourable. But can you tax frequent flying? Can you tax private jets? So I think there are ways to tackle overconsumption. I would just not frame it in a degrowth way. Right. I think.
What do you think of? Because what do you think of the a-growth ways? That we should be agnostic about growth. Like we should focus on addressing these environmental issues and do it in a way, to sustain a level of well-being. And we should just be agnostic about what that does to the size of an economy.
I mean, I think for poor countries, no, because they actually just need economic growth. For rich countries, sure. I think the key question, and the way I frame it in the book for rich countries, is the type of growth that you are producing. Like if a country stimulates large amounts of economic growth by implementing clean energy and loads of these environmentally reducing things, like great. Yeah. I think it's about the type of economic growth. And I think sometimes these kind of debates lead into all growth is bad and we should avoid it at all costs. I think what's important to note about the overconsumption thing that I think people don't get is that in rich countries, if you want to reduce energy demand, you think about consumption, individual behaviours, like what we'd frame as reducing energy services, which is the stuff that you're doing, like the car, the distance you're travelling, or the power you get out the socket. And the question is, the fundamental thing is that we should reduce that. I think what people often don't get is that with decarbonisation, we will just reduce energy demand. And that's because most of the fossil fuels that we're burning is waste.
Inefficient.
Really inefficient. So if you look at any of the projections for where the US or the EU would be on their announced pledges by 2050, energy demand is going down a lot. Yeah. It's just not going down because we're making sacrifices or we're shrinking our economy. We're going down because we're basically producing a really efficient.
So if you have this strict definition, which I know some degrowthers are very strict, it's like it's not about GDP, it's about reducing energy demand and resource demand. You're saying, well, that's an automatic side effect of the energy
decarbonizing your energy demand will go down. Yeah, I think people don't quite get that. Like the example is switching from a petrol car to an electric car. Now, in a petrol car, around 80% of the energy is wasted. Like it's not actually turning the wheels, it's wasted as heat. Now, in an electric car, it's almost the opposite, where your waste is around 20% and 80% is travelling the distance. So to travel the same distance electric car, you reduce your energy use by 3 to 4 times less. Now, if there was a behaviour change where you could say you could reduce your energy use by 3 to 4 times, we would be like, this is amazing. Right, yeah. But because it's a technological change, it's like, oh, boo, that's really bad. I think there are ways that we can reduce energy demand just through decarbonisation. Now, it's not that I'm not in favour of individual behaviour changes, like the book is full of them. And they might even say that some of the stuff in there is degrowth aligned. Like, is eating less meat about degrowth? I wouldn't frame it in degrowth, just eat less meat.
Right. All right, Hannah, I have some more questions, but I can hold on to those. I want to open the questions up to the audience, to the floor. Yeah, please raise your hands. Well, just out of curiosity, are there any degrowthers in the audience who consider themselves degrowthers? Just one lone couple of hands in the back. They're all in the back. What does that say? Okay.
Do you have like a prompt definition of what it means to be a degrowther?
Right, that's a good question. I think that's what we were discussing as well. Some people see it. I think it's often explained as shrinking the economy or reducing GDP, but the way I understand it, it's that especially in wealthy countries, we need to reduce our resource and energy demand in order also to give poorer countries, developing countries, the space to develop, to use more resources, more energy to meet levels of human sustainability. But like you said, it's a difficult discussion because it often, it really is quite unclear how you define it, and you have all different kinds of. But that's how I understand it.
Yeah, I think there's debates. Some people say it's about GDP, then they shifts to like energy resource.
Right. Yeah, I think the argument is that if we would reduce energy demand and resource use in rich countries, we should not be surprised that GDP goes down, and we should organize the economy in such a way that even a reduction of GDP would not harm well-being. So it's also tied up a lot with redistribution, public services, stuff like that. Okay, I've talked enough. Questions from the audience? Raise your hand, please. Yeah, perhaps first at the back and then at the front row. I'm gonna take my jacket off because I'm really hot.
I don't know if I understood it correctly, but I got the impression that you have the opinion that 2 degrees warming might not be so bad, while I understood it that way, that climate scientists say it's we should really put all effort into staying well below 2 degrees. So yeah, I wonder if I understood it correctly.
No, I think 2 degrees is very bad. And I think we need to do all that we can to stay below it. I think the issue with this is it's often framed as like a binary. Either we stay below this number and it's fine, or we go above it and it's really, really bad. I think these impacts are a spectrum, and it's not an all or nothing. And where we land on that spectrum, for me, is a very open question. But no, I think 2 degrees will be extremely bad. I think there is a way by which we could stay just below 2 degrees, but also maintain a reasonably high standard of living. And I think that the issue there is that the people that will suffer the worst impacts at 2 degrees are typically of the lowest incomes and the poorest in the world. And I think in order for us to do that, one, you would need very fast economic growth in these countries, but also support from richer countries. So no, I think 2 degrees is extremely bad, and we would see quite severe impacts. I think there's still the option there for us to mitigate a lot of those impacts.
So what do you see in the role of adaptation? Because a lot of people call themselves climate optimists. They would make the case that, actually 2 degrees, you're saying it's bad. And they're saying, okay, the climate impacts are bad, but we as a human beings are an inventive species. We can adapt to the changes that are heading our way in a world that is 2 degree warming. What's your take on that?
I mean, you can only really adapt to that degree if you have money. You can turn on the air conditioner and you're fine. Most people in the world don't have an air conditioner. So I think it's really about the distribution of those impacts. And I think at 2 degrees, I think there's 2 big concerns I have. One is just direct impact of heat, where people living very close to the equator along the tropics will, for significant portions of the year, just be exposed to really extreme heat. And I think that will have very severe impacts, and I'm worried about that. And the other big point I'm worried on is agriculture, where at 2 degrees warming, in some regions you could see quite significant declines in crop yields. Now again, that is the impact of climate holding everything else constant. There are potentially ways that we can mitigate those impacts through drought-resistant crops, through increased irrigation. But again, it's going to be this distribution impact where the countries that are going to be most affected by this currently already have underinvested agricultural systems. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, its crop yields are much, much lower than the rest of the world. Compound climate change on top of that, and you could see really severe impacts.
So this is the issue of climate, injustice in this case, that you see the effects being unequally distributed.
Yeah, very unequal.
There was a question here at the front row, I think. 2 even.
I heard you bring up 3 elements about big companies who could make a change, fossil fuel companies. about the limited possibilities of politics to make change, and about on the other side, the statement that left or right politics doesn't make a big difference, because they, in the end, also the right side of politics make choice for the cost. Now, I think one of the basic things that is wrong in our whole, the way our economy is organized, is that the cost of pollution is not
priced in.
Yeah, exactly. To change that, you need politics. And I think the big companies keep the politics hostage, kind of. But in the end, it would... so they don't make a choice for a better world because of the cost, because they make choices to lower their costs for the big companies. So I think I don't know what your solution or idea is about breaking that cycle that keeps it hostage.
Yeah, so I think it's not that I don't think left-right politics make any impact. I think my point is that we should try to lessen the divide between left and right, because we need to maintain a persistent climate network that works for decades. And I think if you deliberately make that a left-right issue, you fail on a lot of that. I mean, on the price, no, I agree. Like, the fundamental issue of price with fossil fuels is that the market price is not reflective of the total price, and that's a price that we pay in the future in terms of social costs and environmental costs. The question there on politics is, what does a politician do in that case? Do they set a carbon tax? That would be, in many countries, quite unfavourable, and I expect that they wouldn't get strong public support for that. And I think the issue there is that there is the question of regressive policies. So if you set a carbon tax, how does that affect the poorest in the country disproportionately to the richest in the country? So I think the fundamental issue is that for a long time, fossil fuels have been underpriced in the market, but I don't see that changing very rapidly, which is why I'm more bullish on the alternatives coming in at a cheaper price, because I don't see the fundamental price of fossil fuels changing. But the point is that you can undercut those prices with alternatives, and I think we are starting to see that.
Right. But what do you make of the argument also that it's the influence and the lobbying power of these polluting companies that are actually blocking any progress towards a carbon tax? Because in many countries we already have a carbon tax, at least for certain industries, right? And it's proven also to be quite effective.
Yeah, for certain industries, I think the issue is like an economy-wide carbon tax would be unfavourable. I think for some industries, yeah, it can work, and it can work quite well. Yeah.
And the lobbying power of
No, I think they have had strong lobbying power, and I think they will continue to have strong lobbying power. I just don't have a solution to it, so I'm trying to undercut them in another way.
Right. Yeah, we were talking earlier about also a tax on flying, and how would you prevent from, like you said, harming the family that goes on holiday once a year by plane, and not addressing like the frequent flyer who can easily pay the extra carbon tax. But you could have also progressive carbon tax on frequent flying or on different kinds.
Yeah, the way to, if we want to decarbonize aviation, which I'm quite skeptical that we have technical solutions coming anytime soon, is to finance that through high taxes on very high frequent flyers. Yeah.
More questions from the audience. First one over here in front, and then I see one question in the back.
Hi, you talked about right and left, and you used the term neither candidate for the UK. Have you given up hope for room for green parties to have an impact? And how do you think political change will happen, given this non-pressure from the voters?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say I've completely given up hope, but I think in the UK now it's just like basically two parties. Like I think the Green Party, in some sense, how like they they do get some seats. We call them seats in our government. They do get some seats, and I think they actually make like a bit of a difference. They like shake things up a bit. I'm skeptical that Green Party ever gets like main party votes. I mean, I have been a Green Party supporter and voted, but I decided to stop voting because it felt like a wasted vote because they weren't competing with the main two parties. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
So how do you think there will be a change political? How can we put pressure? Or how will there be pressure?
I mean, I think there is also, like in the UK, I think there actually is pressure. Like, as I said, the right party leader, like, tried to roll back policies, and I think the public didn't like it, and it wasn't, I think he thought that was what the public wanted, and that wasn't what the public wanted. And the alternative, the left-leaning party, have more climate progressive policies, and I think they actually will probably win the next election.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when it comes to politics. It's often, in my view, also not really who is, what party is elected or what party is winning, but also what is in the programs of these parties. So if you look at the electoral program of even center-right parties in the Netherlands when it comes to climate change, it has completely changed from what it was 10 years ago. So even though you haven't had like a Green Party in power, you do see a shift there when it comes to policy suggestions. If you look at the electoral program of the VVD, like our liberal center-right parties, I mean, it's complete change from 8 or 10 years ago. They're now proposing things that perhaps were even too radical for Green parties 10 years ago. So it's more perhaps in that kind of shift.
Yeah, I think you are seeing a shift, and I think the smaller parties like the Green Party can actually do quite a bit, even if they don't have like a really strong foothold. But like pushing, getting like, they do stimulate public discussion, and I think the other leaders then need to take note of that. Like, it's probably slower than we would expect, but I think it is starting to shift.
Right. There was a question in the back there, two even.
Hello.
Hello.
About 50 years ago, I started my work as a circular economist working for the Club of Rome. Hope you all know what it was long ago.
What's your name, sir?
Club of Rome.
What's your name?
Ron Rote.
Ron Rote.
Ron. It's okay. In the meantime, I kept trace of what's happening in the world. And my question at this moment in history would be to you and to myself and to my colleagues in politics and in science, is there a possibility that the political, those who are responsible in politics can introduce a system of rationing that we had in the war, and we had it in the early 70s with gasoline vouchers and so on, in order to limit the use of very scarce minerals and also indirectly the use of stupid consumption goods.
Right.
Please.
All right. A system of rationing. Is that necessary and is it feasible?
I'm very skeptical that it's feasible. I think the war contrast is interesting. I think the issue of climate change is that, and you often see it framed as like on the Don't Look Up film, it was like framed as like an asteroid. I think the issue is that it's not an asteroid, and it's the same as like the war. Like the war was a not necessarily short, but like in comparison to climate change, a short immediate threat, like an asteroid. I think when you have that type of threat, people can get behind this kind of short-term radical change. I think the part of the issue of us addressing climate change is that's not how the problem develops. It's this kind of slow, or you could not necessarily slow, but like this medium-term burn that starts to creep up on us. But there's not an immediate like, we need to act now moment.
Right. So because there's a lot of times there was the comparison made, but with the pandemic, where you also had like drastic government intervention that people were saying, see, if we address it as an emergency, we can actually take drastic societal change. But you're saying that comparison doesn't hold up because they're two different kind of problems.
No, I think the issue there is that the pandemic and the other framings are an immediate threat, and you wouldn't be able to keep up the pandemic lockdowns for 20 years. And that's the kind of timescales we're talking about for the kind of energy transition. So like, I'm afraid I'm a bit skeptical that people would accept the rationing.
So what do you think about this notion of climate emergency, that we're in an ecological emergency, which does, you know, is framed in this way to get people that we cannot go on as business as usual, things are not normal. What do you think of this messaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sometimes use the framing climate crisis, and I think that's an appropriate way. For some reason, that feels a little bit different to me with climate emergency. I think the risk with climate emergency, again, is that this is like decades long. You can't be in an emergency state for decades and decades and decades, which I feel like we would be in. I think there's also been the issue that, I mean, at some local levels in the UK, local councils have declared a climate emergency.
But the argument is also that we need to act, you know, I mean, climate change is continuing, it's a continuing process, but we have a time frame of, you know, 10 years or so to make crucial decisions. I have the feeling that you're also quite skeptical about that kind of framing.
No, because I think energy transitions take much longer. If you look, I mean, there's Václav Smil is the kind of energy transition guy, and he's like very much like energy transitions are very slow. I think I'm more optimistic because I think they could be faster.
Right, because if you follow his idea, then you are then we are doomed.
Although he also he really, I don't know what his opinion. He's very against climate activism and stuff. He's like, I don't know what his framework of change now is. I think he just thinks there's no framework for change. So I'm not as pessimistic as him on the timescales of these transitions, but it's also not a 5 to 10 years, it's a 20 years.
Right, another question over there.
Thank you for your contribution, Hannah. I had a question, and it relates also a little bit to the way that the topic is approached, primarily through the lens of, admittedly, the most important metric to talk about climate change, which is the degrees to which the world will warm up, and also carbon. I was wondering also, and then it makes sense for you to look at the statistics and the longer picture and to talk about the way we frame that debate. But I was wondering, climate change has an impact currently on the world that we live in today in the form of biodiversity loss, in the form of soil degradation, ocean acidification, all these kinds of things that are they're not just gloomy, they're happening right now. And I wonder, are there also cases for optimism, maybe in your book also as well, that you see in mitigating all these effects that are happening currently, rather than just the projections of all the warming up that are going to happen?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's some impacts that will just be irreversible. Some sea level rise will just be unavoidable and irreversible. I think on some things I'm less pessimistic, and quite explicitly in the book, like coral reefs, like I really struggle to see how we'll be able to maintain or restore coral reefs. Even at 1.5 degrees, you'd expect a lot of coral reefs will struggle. At 2 degrees, they certainly will. I think on some other factors, there's maybe a little bit more case for optimism if we tackle other problems. I think on biodiversity loss, currently climate change is not actually the leading driver of biodiversity loss to date. And currently the leading drivers have been direct exploitation, so hunting, overfishing, deforestation, expansion of farmlands, farming. There are ways to significantly relieve pressure on biodiversity by tackling those problems, such that it won't make the climate change impacts go away, but it would significantly reduce pressure on biodiversity, so the total impacts would be less severe. But again, that relies on us taking action on the other problems that I cover in the book.
Thank you. I think there was, now the hands are shooting up everywhere. Okay, you already have the microphone, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have a question also that expands outside of climate change as well. My question is, aren't you afraid of supporting ideas that are false good ideas? And I would like to give one specific example by supporting electrical cars. In this building, a couple of months ago, we had a discussion with women from the mining industry. And basically one of the message was, if you have one of those cars, it means that you're accepting that women being raped for these minerals. So it's kind of ethical and acceptable. And are you afraid to support these kind of ideas by being optimistic in terms of climate change, which is what the data shows, but ethically it's not the case?
Was the question on minerals for electric cars? Was that the
Yes, like all the other harm that also is being caused by electric cars and mineral mining. I think not just environmental impact, but also human rights issues, right?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Like, I think, I think we're going to fundamentally change the underpinnings of our energy system. We're going to move from a model of burning fossil fuels to a model of having renewables, electric cars, other technologies that use different minerals. And that will just fundamentally shift where energy infrastructure is coming from. There are definitely risks in terms of supply chains, both on environmental impacts and social impacts. But I think there are ways that we can mitigate that. I don't think we should accept that to get minerals from a given country, you have to accept that you have really, really poor human rights records. And I think there are ways, we need to take the problems really seriously. But I think there needs to be ways that we can actually produce that in a socially sustainable way. Like a good example there is cobalt and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the human rights records there are extremely poor. Like, you have kids working in the mines because the parents can't afford to send them to school. And we need to fundamentally address that. And actually, I think there are ways of addressing that. Like, many electric cars today are not produced with cobalt. We've shifted away from cobalt in many battery technologies. And I think fundamentally there could be a future where we don't produce electric cars with cobalt. I think the question there is, for the Democratic Republic of Congo, is that the best outcome, right? You have some of the poorest countries in the world that have very valuable resources, and there needs to be a way by which they can benefit from that in a good way, right? The poorest country in the world has a really fundamental mineral. Is there not a way that we can improve supply chains by which they get paid a fair salary, there are good working standards? Like, these are big challenges, but I think they're worth the effort. I think a little tangential to that, I think there's often the argument that by switching from one to the other, you're just maintaining the system as it is today and you're just shifting the source. Like, I don't think that is. We're currently in a system where we're pulling 15 billion tons of fossil fuels out of the ground every year. We'll be shifting to a low carbon energy system where we're using millions or tens of millions a year. So, like, orders of magnitude lower. And there's an opportunity to build a system where you don't just extract. Like, there's a way of developing a more circular economy because you're not consuming those minerals, you're just recycling them. So I think there is a future status quo after a build-up of these minerals where you can reach a much more steady state. But I completely recognise the environmental and social issues. I think we just need to find a way of being able to do that in a responsible way.
Great. Let's see if we can get a question from a woman for a change. Here in the front row,
my question was actually similar to the last question. Because firstly, I wanted to thank you for sharing your perspective from being a scared child, because that was also me, and also still a scared adult. But I also feel like my worries about the environment have really changed about, oh my God, what is going to happen? Just grasping everything that environmental change means to, oh, we're finding solutions and we're exploiting the least having people in the world. And I find it hard to envision how we can keep up this technological innovation in an ethical way, but that was what he asked. But for me, when I think about this is really, for me, also about degrowth and redistribution. Because when you describe degrowth, I thought I'm a degrowther, but I very much connected to decolonization. because I think it's about going away from the mindset that former colonial powers and neo-colonial powers deserve everything, can take everything, and other parts of the world just not.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Also, it's something that's living in the climate community that we need to actually address the climate crisis and neo-colonialism and the colonial history together, because they're intertwined. How do you view this?
No, for sure. But I think the fundamental question is the current system that we've built has also been built on exploitation. I think the way I see it is, and it's not a given that we do it in a sustainable and responsible way, but I think there's a change happening here, and there's a question of this change is therefore an opportunity to build a better system where it's not built on exploitation, that we've put more focus on redistribution, better rights, better working standards. And I think fundamentally there is a way from which the poorest countries in the world, which have some of these resources, can start to see really essential growth. But I know I completely share the concern that you can't just dismantle this system and build exactly the same system over here with a different technology. But I think there'd be very little chance of us being able to move away from this if we were staying in the current system that we have. But we are fundamentally shifting that system, and that's an opportunity, therefore, by which we can do it in a different way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions over there in the yellow shirt?
Hi, thank you. So I'm going to go back to flying, actually, because it's something that I really struggle with. And I have a 14-year-old stepdaughter. And I actually really think that this book you maybe wrote for her, because I see that she's really struggling with this entire topic, right? She's overwhelmed with this. And she actually decided midway through last year that she's never going to fly again. She just literally said, I'm not stepping on a plane. And of course, this means for the family, yeah, you know.
You want an excuse to be able to go on holidays again.
No, I don't know. And this is really actually something, we had long discussions at home. And I was thinking, what are the arguments? Like, I find it difficult to give up summer holidays somewhere in a warm country. I've been a traveler. I'm an explorer. I love going away. But in these conversations with her, I saw this fear, I saw this desperation, I saw her crying and her being scared of the future, like really scared. And I had no arguments, like I have no arguments that I can say to her that justify us stepping on a plane. And I'm not trying to convince her. And at the same time, there is something in me that feels like us not flying once a year is meaningless. It seems like, and I'm like a bit, so what should we do? How can I give her a feeling that she can do something? Because she herself, she's 14, right? She's not voting. What can she do? Like, what would you tell actually her, right? What can I tell her as like her mom?
Yeah, it's difficult, and like your story of your daughter sounds like me. Like I was like really, really struggling, and my parents, I think, really, really struggled seeing the kind of turmoil that I was in. So like I really empathize. I mean, I think it is just very, very difficult to navigate this stuff. The point of what's the role of an individual? What's the role of systemic change? I think a little bit of what I want to push back on, even though I recommend many behavior changes in the book, is that I think many people have this like really deep feeling of guilt regardless of what they do. Like every single behavior, they think, oh, I could do better on this, I could do better on this, I could do better on this. And I think that's just like a heavy burden to carry around, and actually is probably not that productive. I think the challenge is trying to find a balance somewhere of, if it's really, really fundamental to your family that you go on a family holiday, are there other big things that you could do that would help in another way? Like, could you go more plant-based? Could you I don't know what you drive or for whatever your driving situation. Is there
we eat plant-based and we don't drive,
Oh.
so we don't have a car. So what else? Like
Then you deserve a flying holiday once a year.
But yeah, no, I get that it's difficult. Like, sorry, I don't have a.
No, but
good
it's not about finding these arguments why we should fly, because I sort of made peace with this. Like we went on, like we're not looking for like where can we go by train, right? But it's like really this. I saw that. She's looking for ways to feel that she can contribute.
What is interesting to me is that it seems like she's already making quite tough choices in her own life. Is she also active in a different sense? So not only in terms of behavioral change, but is she part of a climate movement? Does she?
No, she's not. And so, like there are certain things that she picked up, like this flying. And I think because this is like this prime example that, it's very easy to hear about this, that's something that you can do. And then there was this Taylor Swift concert, right, in Amsterdam. She so wanted to go, and it was like this thing. And then
Taylor Swift uses a private jet.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, she's like flying every week, probably like 3 times, right? So like, better stop being a Taylor Swift fan.
Oh no, you can't ask that of her.
I mean, I didn't say it to her, right? So like, I didn't make that argument because I thought, it's not productive.
But I'm asking because it reminds me of a conversation I had also with a young climate activist, and she told me like she was in the same position, like she convinced her parents not to fly, take have shorter showers, not eat meat anymore, all that stuff, and she felt like. But I felt powerless when I was watching the news, and in the same evening I saw another license given up for a new oil pipeline, or I saw another contract. And she said once she took the step to become a part of the fossil-free movement, and she addressed like the municipality, she felt like it was empowering in a sense. So I'm not suggesting like your daughter should become a climate rebel or anything, but it is something that if you're part of more of a collective, perhaps that you feel less powerless or less alone.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think one of the issues, the fundamental feelings I also had at that time was that I felt really alone, and like I was screaming out and no one was listening. I think there are so many people now that are so engaged in this that no one should feel alone in it. So I think part of it is, I don't know what our friendship group's like, but I think part of it is also feeling part of something and like you're contributing. I think for young people it is difficult because they don't have a political vote, so they can't act in that way. But I think one of the kind of ways to slightly relieve anxiety is to feel like you're moving forward on something. I think that is part of like being part of a group that is trying to make change. I think also like there's just a bigger question. I mean, she's 14, so she's pretty young, but like what does she want to do like with her career? Like, is there ways she can work towards doing something that would contribute on a bigger level than reducing our personal carbon footprints? I think that's also like a little bit of the problem of the carbon footprint framing. It's just like this really individual, how can you like limit your damage as much as possible? And there's a framing of how can you do as much good as possible, which means stepping beyond your personal carbon footprint to a much broader change.
Thank you.
I hope that helps a little bit. Any more questions over there?
Hi. I've not fully formed this question, but I'll try. Let's say we have to move away from fossil fuel, then we have to move towards electricity, right? And if you're going to move towards electricity, then our grids should be able to handle it. But I see in Netherlands, clearly they cannot handle it. And I'm pretty sure it's the case in UK as well, and in other countries. How do you incentivize the governments to change this? Because if that doesn't change, nothing changes.
No, that's a big. I think actually on the political side, this is where one of the main issues is that many of some of the blocks are economic, but some of the blocks are just getting a permit to build something and put renewable energy on the grid, or getting a grid connection. Like there's so much renewables just like sitting waiting to be connected, but hasn't been connected. So I think we are currently at a phase, a kind of messy phase where the stuff is potentially growing quite quickly but is hindered by the grid. And I think a big part of that is just political reform to find a process by which to speed it up. I think that's a very underrated part of this. I think people don't really think about it.
What I think is interesting is also that this idea, the problems that we're having on the Dutch grid as well. I was talking to a grid, how do you say it, netbeheerders grid, the people who are in charge of the grid. And they're saying it's also quite a positive story in a sense that to some extent the move to renewable energy is going quicker than we expected 10 years ago. So they can't keep up with all the solar panels being installed on rooftops, with all the industries who are looking for ways to electrify their production processes. So obviously this is a main bottleneck that needs to be addressed. But if we want to look at from a positive side, and we're doing that.
We're glad that's the bottleneck and not people building.
Yeah, because the rollout of renewable energies, which demands a change in the grid, is actually going faster than we expected 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think the other fundamental part of that is that if you looked at predictions not too long ago, our grids were supposed to break once we reached 20% renewables. I think we're also realising that our grid can actually run on a much higher share of renewables than many people were expecting 15 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah, for great talk so far. And I already read a lot of your book. I'm a nutritionist, and so I'm specifically interested in the nutrition part, of course. And okay, one of the advices is go vegan. But when you look at the data, then chocolate and coffee is very high, and for instance, herring is very low. How can we communicate that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, you're never going to be able to communicate no chocolate like that.
No. That was my biggest problem also in that one. Yeah.
No, I think you mean from a nutrition perspective or just?
Yeah, well, we have the terms vegan or vegetarian, but in my opinion, we need a sort of new term.
But you mean that like a low carbon diet is not necessarily only vegan, or
yes,
it's broader than just meat and dairy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, when you look at the charts, stuff like coffee is very high. I think part of that's because it's measured in.
Is that now I can ask you? Is that per brewed coffee or the powder only?
No,
because
only the bean. Yeah.
Yeah, so the real impact is maybe a lot lower.
It's lower because your serving size is much smaller than. Okay. You're not using like a kilogram of. So I think coffee is maybe I should add like per serving to the graphs that we have.
Yeah, because that does make a big difference. Of course, that's maybe a factor.
Right.
100.
Yeah. I mean, then on chocolate, I actually think it's probably the same. I think the cocoa will have some footprint, but I think the big part of the footprint is the milk in the chocolate. So it might also have the same effect as coffee, where if you were to reduce it to like a vegan cocoa, where it doesn't have the milk, you might have significantly lower than that.
Drink. I think in the chart it says just chocolate, like the chocolate bars, but
yeah, but they have milk in them, right? So they're cocoa plus milk.
Okay. Yeah.
Milk chocolate. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Does that answer your question, or
okay? So that leans more towards vegan being a good way to communicate, anyways.
Yeah, I think as a general rule, like a simple rule for people, going more plant-based will just reduce your carbon footprint. Now there are like nuances there on specific foods that are maybe like an outlier, but I think if you look at representative diets of different people, like generally shifting to a more plant-based diet just does reduce your carbon footprint. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Next question over here, and then here up front. I'll try to keep track of all the hands being raised.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I fully agree. I think we all should be very glad that you have the time and to answer all your questions. 5 minutes walk from here, I'm working for a consultant firm, and even better, I'm commercial responsible for a lot of, I think, topics that we hear discussing. One of the biggest topics now in the boardrooms, especially for CFOs, is implementing the new laws and the whole compliance about the CSRD compliance. And I think your book...
CSRG, could you briefly explain?
Oh, yes,
Maybe
of course.
Not everybody is
yes, of course. So I think the last 10 or 20 years, the EU tried to force you as a company to collect data about your sustainability, about your carbon footprint, about everything that you can track it for yourself. And 2 or 3 years ago, finally in European Union, you are forced by law to at least track your data. But now I think the most important thing is that your book makes impact because you use a lot of data. And I'm very curious in your vision, if we track, for example, the footprint of a company, what kind of impact would that make if every company should make that report? What do you think about all these new laws?
I think it's a good question. I think one of the benefits of tracking footprints, and I think this also works at like an individual level of, I don't really like the carbon calculators where you try and optimize, because I think like there's probably like quite wide error margins in there. I think the fundamental utility of taking a broad look at your carbon footprint is you identify the big things that change, right? You notice the stuff that's really tiny and doesn't make an impact, and you can see the big things that would actually shift the needle. And my feeling from companies tracking that, like it's not a given that they then reduce or feel the need to reduce, but I think it does actually just flag up to them, oh, there's this like one part of our supply chain that makes up 60% of our carbon footprint. So I think it's not like a cure-all, but it's definitely a good starting point to get some basis of where are our emissions coming from, where is our impact coming from, which I think people have a misguided perception of. So I think that would be like a good starting point and might actually shift stuff already.
Nice, thank you.
Right, there was a question up front here.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that you're more positive about the energy transition than the agricultural one. I personally feel the same. I came across something called precision fermentation. I'm not sure you're familiar, probably. But I was wondering how you look at that, because it made me very hopeful.
And could you explain briefly what is precision fermentation?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of kind of, you'd say, biotechnologies which can pretty much produce pretty high quality protein, but with a like pretty low impact. And there are a range of meat substitutes now on the market, and precision fermentation is one of those possibilities. I think I think on the technology side, I'm actually still quite optimistic on the food stuff. I think for precision fermentation, I think lab-grown meat is actually, we don't see it on the market yet, but if you look at the cost reductions from companies, it's moving pretty quickly and is falling pretty fast. I think the technologies will be there. I think I'm less optimistic about the public's willingness to shift to them. So I think if you were to see a parallel for energy, it would be like we would have solar and wind and electric vehicles that were really cheap, but no one wanted them. I think on food, I think the technologies will ultimately be there. I think I'm just a bit pessimistic that, people shift to them.
And what do you think? What do you think that is? Is it because it's tied up food with culture, with identity?
Yeah, food has a really strong identity component. I think there is this challenge on food where we instinctively favour natural versus synthetic. I think people really push back against kind of synthetic food, which all of our kind of best solutions to are ultimately synthetic. So I think there's that tension. I think my one cause for optimism there is that we actually just haven't tried it, so we don't know how people react. Like if there's a cost competitive lab-grown meat burger on the menu, will people pick it? I don't know. Maybe there's a case for optimism there that people actually will just shift to that quite quickly. I think on the food stuff, I was always quite optimistic that stuff like Impossible burgers or Beyond Meat burgers, like to me, these taste pretty good. if they were just there, people would like them and shift to them. And I'm quite pessimistic about that now because it's not shifting. That might be different for basically a direct replica of meat, lab-grown meat is meat, is just without the animal. So maybe that might be very different from a traditional like meat substitute. So I think that's still to be tested. So I'm going to hold out some optimism that we have an unsaturated question there.
All right. Okay, a lot of questions. I think you were with your hand up, and there's a question. Right? Maybe we can get those two together, the two questions at once.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought it was interesting what you said in the beginning about changing the narrative. I think what you said about, like, you know, at first there was a narrative of fear and it got people kind of feeling the urgency. And I think that's also why we have now so many people that are engaged. And I think it's really growing fast. And also what you said about your daughter, like she feels really the urgency and the fear. So this narrative kind of worked for the first part. But now for the next step is to move these engaged people into action. So there's a need for another narrative that kind of, I think, gives a vision, like a goal. Where are we heading to? You know, what's the solution that we are striving for? Like, like a vision to go that moves you forward, that keeps you, that kind of stimulates the action. So, you know, maybe the kind of hopelessness that people fear or that people feel also have to do with the lack of vision, like a new vision. Where are we heading towards? Like a positive vision that we strive to find. So what should this new narrative be?
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree. I think as I say, like I think the fear and the concern about what the future looks like and what's at stake initially gets people engaged, and I think that actually has been successful, and many people are engaged. I think the way that I would want to reframe it again is like this is framed more around like damage limitation. It's framed as like the future is inevitably going to be worse. We just will decide how bad it's going to be. And I think we need to reframe that as in 2050 or 2060, what world do we want to look like, and how do we build what we need to get there? I don't say I perfectly do it in the book, but I try to elicit like what that would look like and show some positive steps in that direction. But no, I fully agree. I think we need a more positive vision of what we're working for rather than just framing it as what are we trying to avoid.
All right. Thank you. I saw a couple of hands going up over there as well. Or were the questions? Yeah, over there. Rico, can you get the...
Still has the phone. I still have one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you again. The question is, do you have an opinion about geoengineering?
Short question, but an important question. Geoengineering. Also, Hannah, could you briefly explain what it is and what do you think about it?
Yeah, so geoengineering is basically implementing technological solution that would allow us to bring the climate back to a given state. Like in simple terms, could we cool the climate using technology? And there's various ways of doing that. There's satellites in space. There's emitting sulfur to reflect sunlight so you get less incoming solar. I think my perspective on this is, I mean, it's again a very controversial issue. I think my stance on this is that I would like to see small amounts of investment in geoengineering, probably under the understanding of a moratorium that no one deploys it. I think my reasoning for that is twofold. Like we might just hit a point in the climate system that is completely unknown, and we want an emergency stop button. I think there's also the risk that these types of technologies, a country could actually deploy them pretty quickly. It's not that cheap. No, it is quite cheap. It's not that expensive. And I think the issue we have geopolitically is that different countries have very different thresholds by which they're willing to accept that temperature rise. Like impacts for some countries will just be much more severe. Right. And you might reach a stage where a country just says, we just won't accept this anymore and we're going to go for it. And the risk is that if invest in trying to understand the potential impacts of this, we might be flying completely blind. So I don't see it as we should be investing loads in this as that's just ultimately what we should do, but I think we should be cautiously looking at it to understand what the impacts would be if we really decide we need to do this fundamentally at a global level, or if a country decides geopolitically we're just going to do this.
All right, question over there.
Hi. I think it's a nice follow-up to the food question before. So I work in the food industry as a sustainability manager. And I try to do my work from the perspective of where can I have the most impact? What are the main drivers, the biggest one? And there I start. So leaving this room, I would like to ask your advice, like what are the big impact buckets that I can focus on from the food industry? Also often hearing the argument, yes, but the energy transition is gonna solve our problems.
Right. Can I ask, like,
besides behavior change?
What in the food industry, like what does that mean? Like,
I work for Unilever. Nutrition, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the argument that you shouldn't be working on food and you should be working on energy is a poor one. Like, there's 8 billion of us. We can tackle more than one element of this at the same time. And I think food is fundamentally important on climate. Like, it's a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think, no, we won't, by tackling food alone, we won't solve climate change. But the opposite is also true, that if you look at projected emissions out to 2050 or further, just from food alone, we would exceed our 1.5 degree budget, and we'd get pretty close to using up a lot of the 2 degree budget. So the notion that, you know, we'll solve this without tackling food at all is wrong. So I think it's good that people are working on food. I mean, if you're working on Unilever, you probably have like a pretty good lever there to pull. I mean, I think there are a range of like really promising startups in this area. Like, I would focus on how do you... I would work more on the supply side than the demand side, and like, how do you support really sustainable meat substitute products that have a good chance of getting on the market? For me, that's like fundamental. I think in your position, that's the biggest impact that I think you could have, and I think you probably will have a big impact.
There was a question in the front row.
Hey, thanks. I'm Fabian. I'm a researcher at the University of Amsterdam. First of all, thank you for all the work you're doing, especially during COVID. It was really like essential work. Thank you very much. I've read your book. I can recommend it. It's easy reading. In a good way. In a good way.
That means it's very simple.
But no. But no. Okay, I'm backtracking. You can cut this from the recording. No, but I am a bit torn about it. So I really like the notion, the refocus on sustainability as meeting current needs. Right, you really provide excellent context of our many environmental issues, and it's good to be aware, you know, that progress has been made. Right, you quote this line from Maxwell's, right? I mean, progress has been made. We can still make progress, but it's still bad, right? But then on the other hand, you're reading in the first couple of pages, you know, I mean, you start with, it has been common to tell the kids that they're going to die from climate change, right? We hardly blink when we tell our children that. I don't think that that's the case, right? I mean, you seem then to mischaracterize Letzte Generation with what the journalist pointed out, also Extinction Rebellion, right? You seem to be shifting the goalpost a little bit. Here you say, you know, let's say we stop trying and temperatures climb by another 1 or 2 degrees, right? We can probably, if you're in a wealthy country, you'll probably be okay, right? But this would be 3 degrees, right? That would be certainly the end of the world as we know it, right? And so I'm torn between the positive impact that your book can have by indeed having a different narrative, a different framing to reach the majority, the silent majority. But on the other hand, I also worry that, you know, you seem to be shifting the goalpost a little bit. 2 degrees we can probably manage, you know, ignoring all this latest science on tipping points, right? The IPCC says there's a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. and dissing these climate movements, right? Critiquing degrowth in a really fundamentally unscholarly way, because nobody is taking these positions as you paint them. So there are a lot of strawmen. So I'm wondering whether it also can have a negative impact, right? Because it gets amplified in New York Times and The Guardian and so on, where people think, well, yeah, maybe it is not the end of the world, you know. While I'm actually of the opinion that people should realize that this is the greatest challenge we've ever faced, right? And that they have a responsibility also, being alive at this moment in time, to take radical action, right? To be on the streets and so on. And we're not seeing this commensurate with the threat ahead, right? So I feel on the negative side, this book could have this effect that, well, yeah, actually it's not so bad, you know. I'm going back to sleep and so on. So I'm curious how you juggle these two possible impacts of your book, which you say is apolitical, but is very political, right? So I'm curious how you reason about that. And I'm personally torn as well, right? So please, thank you.
No, I take the criticism, and I think managing to balance getting across the scale of the problem without and the potential for solutions without leading people into a sense of either complacency or feeling completely helpless is hard. Like I get that. I mean, for most people that have read the book, it's actually had the opposite effect. Like the feedback I've got is, like I got an email from someone the other day and saying, I wanted to transition my career into working more on climate, but I've been dragging my heels for a long time because I feel helpless and that makes no difference. I've read your book and I've decided, no, there's something I can do. I'm going to move into that. Now, for some people, okay, they may weaponize that and say, oh, she's saying that it's not that bad. Like, I'm not. I'm very clear the trajectory we're on today is completely unacceptable and have catastrophic impacts. Like at 2 degrees, I think that's really, really pretty terrible and can have really dramatic impact. The question is, how do you move the trajectory we're on to one closer to 2 degrees or below? And I think again, it comes down to the narrative that you're telling. I think just telling the narrative, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, and going to be bad, is probably not going to get us there. We need to balance the it's going to be bad with the sense of there's something we can do about it. And I think that's what I'm trying to push back on, is this growing narrative that all is lost and there's nothing we can do, which I feel is coming up very strongly. Like I get it a lot. So that's what I'm trying to push back on.
Right. Do you need a brief follow-up question? And
no, let's just talk over drinks.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Another question here on the front row. I think we have time for after this for about 2 questions. So really think about if you have something very important to ask that we cannot miss.
The pressure.
But yeah, you're fine. We have 2 more questions afterwards.
Okay, good. I was wondering now if, in an ideal case, most people would move to plant-based food. Wouldn't we not be running into other issues, say like monocultures, the chemicals used, water supplies, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the question people have is that if you shift to more plant-based diet, do we have enough cropland for that? I think it's important to note that a lot of the food we're currently producing through monocultures is fed to animals. Like half of the world's cereals actually go directly to humans. The other half is either put into cars for biofuels or is fed to animals. Like 3/4 of the soy that the world produces is fed to animals. So actually by switching to a more plant-based diet, we would just need to grow far less crops. So I think on many of these metrics, shifting to a more plant-based diet would reduce pressures on land, fertilizers. Manure is a big one, is a big source of water pollution. Water use, like generally if you look at water use across different food types, typically animal-based products use much, much more. So I think it would actually relieve pressure on many of these problems.
Right. Penultimate question. Anyone here?
Hi, so this actually refers back to, I think, what you said about the CSRD. First of all, I will say I'm in favor of this because I think it needs transparency to hold companies accountable. But then I've heard recently about initiatives like the Carbon Disclosure Project, where I think companies can go to and voluntarily disclose their data, which can help policy development. And so I was wondering, have you heard about this, and have you heard about other initiatives and where this actually has also worked?
Yeah, I think the carbon. I mean, I'm not familiar with this specific policy, but I'm familiar with the Carbon Disclosure Project. And I think actually an increasing number of companies are now doing that voluntarily and are monitoring their emissions and scaling it up. And I think there is some light research to show there that even companies that start doing this on a voluntary basis, just measuring their emissions, actually have a greater impact on reducing them. So I think we will increasingly see this trend, and I think it's a positive one. One, in just transparency of measuring, but also I think it does actually push companies to try to reduce.
Final question. Anyone? A degrowther in the back, right? Yeah, you're holding on. You're saving the best for last.
So yeah, I've had a long time to think about how I can give a positive spin on degrowth for you. And I'll try, no pressure as the last question, but I think if you think of post-scarcity and abundance, I think that's a positive thing, because when there's scarcities, you want to earn more than earn as much as you can, and also spend as much as you can and consume as much as you can. But you see the richest people in the world, they might give away 99% of their money, because that 1% is still a ridiculous amount because of the huge inequality. And I personally don't have that. But I do have, for instance, in the past, salt used to be scarce, right? It used to be a currency. People paid with salt. But I have a kilo of salt at home. And so I have an abundance of salt. I'm not going to eat a kilo of salt. And I think it's more luxurious to consume as much as salt as you can. That's one thing. That's what people are doing now. And I think the future, the positive form of degrowth might be, it's even more luxurious to have abundance and to eat less salt because you don't have to eat it at all. So do you think, could you believe in that positive version of degrowth?
Nice, I haven't heard that one before. Degrowth with abundance. How do you feel about that?
I guess I don't fully get the framing.
Can you clarify briefly?
So instead of being entitled to spend all the money you earn, it's like, hey, I earned 3,000 euros, so I can have 30 Ryanair flights because I have the money. It's my money, I can spend it as I want. But instead of that, you think, okay, I don't think about how much money I have, so I have to consume as much as I want, because that's sort of the default that a lot of people have, right? So more salary, more consumption, and that has to stop somewhere because it cannot go on forever. But if you feel like, okay, I'm going to make choices that I feel good about myself because I want to, and not because something is limiting me or because of guilt, but just because I know I don't have to spend all my money, or I don't have to ruin the whole planet.
So I guess what you're asking is that it's also tied up with a mentality change where consuming more is not considered to be the ultimate goal of living well. Is that
exactly just like
yeah?
I think that's fair. I think I'm not necessarily sure that people necessarily think it's always about consumption. I think the rebuttal that people would make about, there's always this question of economic growth on a finite planet. And I think that is true if you assume that growth and abundance are really tightly and always tightly linked to resources. So I think people would make the counter argument there are ways of producing value, which is basically what economic growth tries to capture, without being tightly linked to consumption or resource consumption. And I think in that sense, there is a way by which you could continue growth without increased resource consumption, because you are placing value on non-physical entities, which I think in rich countries actually probably there is the possibility to move away from that. So I think maybe that there's a bridge there where what you've got post-growth or abundance is not linked to resource consumption, but it's linked to other things that we might value.
Okay, Hannah, final question. That's the privilege of the moderator. I think we've discussed it already, but just to wrap it up, like, what is the main message, the main action you'd hope that the climate movement or people are being concerned with climate change take from your book and from conversations like these we're having tonight?
I think it's fundamental to recognize that these efforts have brought us to the position where we actually have the opportunity to change, and change is looking ever more likely. The key message of the book is that we're facing a range of really, really large problems, really, really scary problems, but all hope is not lost. Progress is happening, even if it is not clearly apparent, and there is the possibility that we rapidly increase that. So what I would hope that people would take from the book is that they can recognize that change is happening and be motivated to contribute more of it.
Hannah, thank you so much. Give a warm applause for Hannah Ritchie, everybody. Okay, so for those of you who want to know more and haven't read the book already, it's for sale outside, and Hannah's told me she's even willing to sign it. We can also continue this conversation at the bar downstairs, and I would kindly ask you also to support Pakhuis de Zwijger. You become a friend of Pakhuis de Zwijger, which is extra important in times like these. Thank you for coming, everybody. Have a good evening.